Now, as the firestorm over the president's Charlottesville remarks has intensified, Mnuchin was one of the cabinet members standing by the president as he tried to defend protesters rallying with neo-Nazis in Charlottesville. Nearly 300 of the secretary's classmates at his alma mater of Yale just signed a letter to him, and at part, this is how it reads. President Trump has declared himself a sympathizer with groups whose values are antithetical to those values we consider fundamental to our sacred honor as Americans, as men and women of Yale, and as decent human beings. President Trump made those declarations loudly, clearly, and unequivocally, and he said them as you stood next to him. We can be Republicans, Democrats, Libertarians, Greens, and a number of other things, still be friends, classmates, patriots, but we cannot be Nazis, white supremacists. We can disagree on the means of promoting the general welfare of the country, on the size and role of government, on the nature of freedom and security, but we cannot take the side of what we know to be evil. With me now, James Donnellan, Mnuchin's former classmate who actually wrote the letter, Matthew Countryman, who is the one who started this whole thing. So, gentlemen, welcome to you.
Thank you.
All right, so Matthew, you took this idea to your Yale Class of '85 Facebook page. We understand the why from reading the letter, but how quick was the response?
Instant, actually. So I'd heard that Trump had said something, but I didn't get to see the video till early evening, and I was so shocked. And to see my classmate there saying not a word was just so disturbing, so upsetting. To give validation to the forces of racial hatred in our past was really just more than I could take. And so I just expressed myself on the Facebook page. I didn't know how much people would feel the same way I did. I didn't know whether this would get people to act, but I just wanted to know. I literally asked the question, who is willing to call for him to resign? And the response was instant. James among them, and not people I didn't know necessarily well, so not in touch with, but was really widespread too, that people wanted to find a way for us to express our revulsion.
So teamwork here. James, you're the one who takes it upon yourself to write this letter. I understand it took you all of 20 minutes to fire this thing off. Let me hear just in your own words why you want Mnuchin out.
Well, there comes a point when ordinary politics is left behind and a moral absolute imperative comes to the fore. And I think we've reached that point now that Trump has said what he said. He said it very clearly. He really meant it. And our esteemed classmate was standing next to him. That in itself is a statement. You can't stand silent when something like this happens. It has to be something you confront.
But what about if you look at it from the flip side of this? Both of you, James, to you first, thinking that maybe the nation needs someone like Mnuchin in the White House, who is Jewish, who is presumably disturbed by those comments from, of the presidents from Trump Tower inside the cabinet. I mean, that it's too risky to put someone unknown there, James.
I understand and appreciate that argument, but we've reached the point where we're basically enabling a failing administration, and we need to accelerate Trump's departure and the shutdown of normal business in the White House as soon as possible. And in particular, I think we can really think about what it means to be in the leadership. I have no doubt that the good civil servants of the Treasury Department will keep the place running very well in Mr. Mnuchin's absence, should he decide to resign. It's whether one promotes the ideological basis of the Trump administration that is most important. I think anybody who is associated with that on the side of the political appointees, the higher offices of the Trump administration, I think it's time to get out of there.
It's my understanding neither of you have Secretary on speed dial. I don't think you're super close with him, but Matthew, I mean, I imagine he holds Yale near and dear to him, and does anyone from your class of '85 talk to him regularly, and how much sway do you think that this letter might have on him?
I'm not sure sway is the issue. Nor do I think his Judaism is the issue. I think it's a question of basic moral principles. Right? Are you willing to participate in an administration that's giving license to political forces of racial hatred of our racial past that is in fact standing against the kinds of efforts to build a multiracial, multi-ethnic, religiously diverse democracy. These are not political questions in my mind. These are questions of moral judgment. And I hope he hears our message. I hope that the people who do talk to him, I'm sure he has classmates he's close to. I'm sure there are people who are very dear to him who feel the same way. I would expect that there would be. I don't know them, but I'm sure they're there. And I hope that this message gets through, that this is not a matter of the debt ceiling or of the infrastructure project or anything else. This is a question of what kind of democracy, what kind of nation will we be, and whose side is he on?
Got it. James Donnellan, Matthew Countryman, thank you both.
Thank you.
More on the breaking news today. Welcome back. We have much more on the firing, the breaking news firing of the White House chief strategist Steve Bannon, turning now to firestorm engulfing the president's controversial remarks after who was to blame for the violence in Charlottesville. So the deadly violence happened now nearly a week ago. And since then, vandals have hit Confederate statues and monuments all across the country. This is not just in the South. One of the latest happened at Duke University Chapel in Durham, North Carolina. Someone damaged a statue bearing the likeness of the Confederate General Robert E. Lee at the entrance. Now, remember, racists say they were there protesting the removal of the statue of Lee when they rallied in Charlottesville, and the president renewed his support of Confederate monuments this week. This is what he tweeted. Sad to see the history and culture of our great country being ripped apart with the removal of our beautiful statues and monuments. You... ... can't change history, but you can learn from it. Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, who's next? Washington, Jefferson, so foolish. And that's the end of that. So joining me now, a member of the Carolina chapter of the Sons of Confederate Veterans. He is a commander of the Blue Ridge Brigade. His name is Bill Starnes. Bill, thank you so much for being with me.
Yes, ma'am. Thanks for having me.
So listen, I want to hear all perspectives of this week, including from yourself. I understand you agree with the president that these statues represent, history and culture. Tell me why you want to keep them up.
Well, it's very simple, and I do want to make clear I'm not speaking for the Sons of Confederate Veterans, although I am a member. I'm speaking for myself here.
Sure.
I believe those statues represent the honor, the courage, and bravery of the Confederate soldier. Those soldiers, based on 17 years of historic research that I've done, those soldiers were not fighting to perpetuate the institution of slavery. They were fighting for the constitutional rights of government at the consent of the governed. There is nothing in the Constitution.
Hang on, because if you really want to talk about the history of this chapter of our country, the consensus among historians, and I've got one that we'll talk to in a second here, is that the Civil War wasn't about state rights and secession. This was about upholding the economic system of slavery. In fact, let me just quote, this is Harvard University president and historian. Historians are pretty united on the cause of the Civil War being slavery and the kind of research that historians have undertaken, especially in the years since the centennial, where there has been so much interest in this question of the role of race and slavery in the U.S. That research has shown pretty decisively that when the various states announced their plans for succession, they uniformly said that the main motivating factor was to defend slavery. I mean, I know as a proud Southerner, you don't want to hear that, but you can't rewrite history.
I'm not trying to rewrite history. The professor there needs to actually study some history before he opens his mouth and says something that stupid. Number one, if you go back to 1850 all the way up to 1861 and find for me one bill, one law in the United States Congress that they were working on to end the institution of slavery nationwide, then I might say he has a point. There was no such bill in the 1850s or the early 1860s to end slavery in the United States. In fact, the only constitutional amendment or bill I could find in Congress was in 1861 that pertained to slavery. That was what came to be known as the Corwin Amendment, which clearly stated that Congress shall never have the authority to interfere with the institutions within the states, including those institutions pertaining to service and holding people to service and labor. That was known as the Slavery Forever Amendment.
And I can't sit here and check you on, yes, sir, and I can't check you on bills written in the 1850s off the top of my head. But here,
I would go look at them before I did an interview on them. I mean, the bottom line is there were no bills in Congress.
Hang on, sir. With all due respect, as a fellow Southerner, with all due respect, I did do my homework, and I just cited this quote, and I have a historian coming up. So please, sir, don't tell me to do homework. Secondly, let's move that aside and talk about the pain in this country. You know, when you look at a place like Germany, where they don't force Jewish children to attend a school named after Adolf Hitler, it is the same for a lot of African Americans in this country, you know, attending a school, say, named after Robert E. Lee. What do you say to the, let's not, facts is one thing, feelings is another, to acknowledge those feelings of those Americans?
Well, facts are one thing and feelings are another. And the truth on this, the pure fact is Abraham Lincoln and Adolf Hitler have a lot more in common than Robert E. Lee and Adolf Hitler. Robert E. Lee did not kill civilians. Abraham Lincoln did. The Union Army came into the South. The Union Army came into the South and killed over 70,000 Southern civilians, men, women, and children, black and white, slave and free. So, yeah, they did that. You can study some history and find that out. It's very easy to look at. As far as comparing Robert E. Lee to Adolf Hitler,
anti-slavery, as a result of that, states wanted to succeed. I don't think we want to compare Adolf Hitler and Abraham Lincoln. Bill Starnes, thank you so much. Thank you. We got to go. Historian, I just got to bring you right in.
Well, I mean, I was ready to talk to this gentleman about the pain of eras where people fight for the losing side and the lost cause, and the fact that we don't hold every foot soldier responsible for the actions of their commanders. But then he compared Abraham Lincoln to it. Let me say, we are in a very, very emotional moment.
We are. And that's why I wanted to have him on, by the way.
No.
It was my idea. I wanted to have the Sons of Confederacy.
And I'm not here to lecture because, by the way, I'm not a Civil War expert. I have colleagues who are. I had to learn about it, of course. But this is the most important thing. The reason why those statues matter is not that anybody wants to erase the fact of the Confederate States of America. It's part of American history. It's that those statues were put up, many of them, in the era of Jim Crow, when there were bitter enders. There were Southerners who didn't want African Americans to enjoy all of the rights of citizenship. And these people put those statues up so that African Americans would be put in their place. That's what this is about. Our country has evolved. And Shannon is going to tell you a great story.
Forgive my rudeness as I just jumped in.
No,
this
Shannon.
Is Shannon Lanier, and you are how many greats?
Sixth great-grandson of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings.
Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings.
Yes.
You've listened to all of this. What do you think?
Yes, and your last guest, if he did need some form of documentation, he can look at the original draft of the Declaration of Independence, which Jefferson wrote, that did include freeing slaves, but that was one of the largest debates during that time, whether it was going to stay in or stay out. Of course, it was taken out of the Declaration of Independence, but if he needed some documentation, he has it. And I agree with you that this is an opportunity for the country to step forward and get rid of some of those sites and those statues. I don't think they should be destroyed. I think they should be put in historical places like a museum where you can add context to who they are and the whole story, instead of just them being praised and held for the horrible acts that they did.
You know, I learned, I was in Charlottesville when this debate over Sally Hemings reached a point where the Thomas Jefferson Foundation changed its approach to it. For decades, they denied the possibility that Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson had children. But thanks to DNA evidence, they couldn't deny it any longer. Now, they could have been bitter enders. They could have said, I don't have 100% certainty. But they decided that they understood that history evolves. So they changed not just their public statements, but their exhibits. And they welcomed Shannon's family. What I'm adding today, what we need today is more of that.
That's
you
what
want to learn.
Yes.
You want to learn
You're reading
something.
my mind, Tim.
It's about educating people, and I think that's what's being a miscomponent. People aren't being educated about the full history of this story. It's a complicated history that this country has come through, and we need to start educating people about all of it, the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Can we end with, I feel like this reunion in Monticello, Thomas Jefferson's beautiful home. I lived in Charlottesville. It's a special place, the good and the ugly and everything in between. And this reunion of descendants of Martha and Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings came together in the wake of the DNA. And it was, I mean, I've heard you speak about it. It was like the family. It was, people weren't at each other's throats over history. Can you just tell me about that moment and how we can learn from that?
Well, I think that first meeting, it was in some aspects divisive because people wanted it to be, but there were so many great stories where people were meeting each other for the first time and saying how they're more alike than they are different, seeing each other as family. And I think if this family can come together and stand as one, then other people in this country can put their differences aside, regardless of how many years they were separated by slavery, but can come together and unify as a country. And that's what this fight is about, unifying as a country and standing for what America now should represent, not what it did years and years ago. We have evolved, and it's time for
Shannon,
change.
thank you so much for doing that and for coming on. And for Tim, sorry to put you on the spot on your Civil War history there, but needed to. Thank you both so much. And I thank Bill as well for coming on here. Coming up, much more, though, on the breaking news. Steve Bannon is out at the White House. We're right back.
Get your first 2 weeks free at Hubble Contacts.
The breaking news, we're following Steve Bannon. The president's chief strategist in the White House has now left. He is no longer the chief strategist. I want to bring in Robert Kuttner. He's a co-editor of American Prospect. He was the journalist who interviewed Steve Bannon earlier this week and caused such a huge stir. Bob, thanks so much for joining us. Let me get your immediate reaction to the word that Steve Bannon, the man you spoke to on the phone, is now officially out.
Well, I'm stunned. I think, as your panel indicated, he was pretty much on the ropes before this happened. So maybe this was the last straw. But you know, the Greeks used to say that character is fate, and he's been displaying a kind of recklessness, a kind of freelancing that put him on very thin ice. And I think it was only a matter of time. And the recklessness fully on display in the conversation with me, not just in terms of what he said about his colleagues, about his boss, about himself, but in terms of just neglecting to even say whether we were on the record or off the record. And this is not a rookie. I mean, it was a rookie error by one of the savviest media operators in the country, in the world.
What was the most reckless thing that you recall Steve Bannon saying about the president of the United States in that interview you had with him?
Well, I think directly contradicting the president's view on Korea, that was pretty reckless. I think going into great detail about the infighting, who he was going to get fired by name. Her job is probably as safe as anybody's job in America right now. And the fact that, you know, he had problems with Gary Cohn. I mean, it was like he was taking on everybody all at once. And I think the other thing that was reckless was his assumption that because he and I happen to have a convergent critique of America-China policy, that I would somehow look the other way, being the editor of a liberal magazine, the American Prospect, that I would somehow look the other way at all of the racism, all of the xenophobia that he's been the architect of, and that he could somehow BS his way into saying, oh, those people are a bunch of clowns. I mean, the things that he said about his own allies were pretty reckless. And I think the assumption that he's going to build a grand left-right coalition for a different trade policy on China, and there have been liberal critics, I think for very good reason. I'm one of them, of the fact that we're letting China to take us to the cleaners with American industry. But the assumption that you could build a grand left-right alliance that would change this policy, I mean, think about it. You can just imagine Steve Bannon going into a meeting of U.S. Trade Rep or Defense Department or National Security Council and saying, all right, here's the game plan. We're going to change our whole China policy. And by the way, I've got Bob Kuttner on my side. And that doesn't exactly enhance his credibility at the Trump White House.
Yeah, and on North Korea, the interview occurred after the president said fire and fury, after the president said the U.S. military was locked and loaded. And in the interview with you, he said, this is Steve Bannon, there's no military solution to North Korea's nuclear threats. Forget it. Until somebody solves the part of the equation that shows me that 10 million people in Seoul don't die in the first 30 minutes from conventional weapons, I don't know what you're talking about. There's no military solution here. They got us. That is in total contradiction to what the president was suggesting in the days leading up to that interview. That must have so startled you to hear that from Steve Bannon.
Well, not only did it startle me, but it was also a lot saner as policy than the president's own view. So one question I have that I think was implicit in the discussion before you brought me in, Trump is famous for having back channel conversations with anybody and everybody in his circle. So even if Trump is forced out as the official political strategist, is Trump going to continue to have back channel conversations with him? Because Bannon is the architect of the strategy of getting into bed with the far right. Ever since the initial events in Charlottesville, Trump has been doubling down on that, I would assume with Bannon's encouragement, or if not explicit encouragement, Bannon's fingerprints are on that. What does he do now with Bannon out, with this strategy of becoming more and more reckless himself about stoking up the neo-Nazi right? What's that going to be like without Bannon there to hold his hand and walk him through it? Or Bannon's still going to be there at the end of a phone?
Because there are several people who have been fired or have resigned from this president either during the campaign or since he became president, and the president still maintains, you're absolutely right, that back channel communication. And so you suspect that the communication with Steve Bannon will continue even though he is out officially from the White House.
I think it makes the White House itself more chaotic, but it also means that Trump is even more reliant on all of these back channels. And I think the man of the hour is General Kelly. I mean, what is he going to do? If he had not succeeded in forcing Trump out, it would have shown that he's impotent. So now we know that he has some power, but does he have enough power given all of the propensities of the president?
You know what? I want to just play for you, Bob, what the President of the United States in that off-the-rails news conference he had Tuesday in the lobby at Trump Tower, he was asked about Steve Bannon's future, and his words were pretty precise. Listen to this.
Look, I like Mr. Bannon. He's a friend of mine. But Mr. Bannon came on very late. You know that. I went through 17 senators, governors, and I won all the primaries. Mr. Bannon came on very much later than that. And I like him. He's a good man. He is not a racist. I can tell you that. He's a good person. He actually gets a very unfair press in that regard. But we'll see what happens with Mr. Bannon. But he's a good person, and I think the press treats him, frankly, very unfairly.
We'll see what happens. And our Jim Acosta, our senior White House correspondent, Bob, is reporting that Bannon was supposed to be fired 2 weeks ago, that according to a White House official, but the firing was put off. But go ahead and react. I wonder what you thought when you heard the president say, we'll see what happens, Steve Bannon, because that's, to me, that was a sign he's gone.
Yeah, and it's even more vivid in hindsight. That's what you say when you're about to give somebody a gold watch.
Bob Kuttner, thanks so much for joining us. He's the co-editor of the American Prospect. He did that very, very important interview the other day with Steve Bannon. And that interview, by all accounts, Bob, I'm sure had a role to play in the decision today that Steve Bannon is no longer the senior strategic advisor to the President of the United States. Thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you. Bye-bye.
You know, when the President said, John King, that we'll see what happens, we knew what was going to happen.
We did. I just want to quickly say I read Bob Kuttner for 20 years plus years now, one of the more thoughtful people in the progressive movement, even if you're a conservative, especially on economic policy, that he's in the middle of this, given the liberal American Prospect, talking to the alt-right Steve Bannon. The ironies, Washington is a very different place in this environment. But to the point that sound you just played from the president, this is part of the issue and part of the question, and it goes well beyond Steve Bannon. He's asked about Steve Bannon, and he's essentially, the president says, I did this. He came on late in the campaign. It's always about the campaign. He's been president of the United States for 7 months. He has 0 significant legislative achievements. None of his signature campaign promises have made it to the finish line. And you ask him a question about something that's going on in his White House, and it's always back to the campaign. This is the fundamental problem of the Trump presidency. Not who's the chief of staff and who's the chief strategist. That is not to understate the drama of this moment and the significance of somebody as larger, or actually a larger-than-life figure of Steve Bannon being shown the door. But the new chief of staff, maybe he picks a new strategist. Maybe he works with the president on that. It's not about the personnel. It's about the president. Every answer goes back to the campaign. The campaign's over. He's president. Obamacare is still the law of the land. Tax reform is nowhere. He had an event the other day that dissolved into what you just played us there that was supposed to be an infrastructure. That plan doesn't even exist. I do wonder at some point, I know the Trump voters are incredibly personal loyal to this president. At some point, they're good people. They're common sense people. They can do the math. They're going to ask, what happened to I'm going to run it like a business? What happened to Washington is stupid and I know how to fix it? Where is that? To Bob's other point about the outside circle of advisors, I think he raises a key question because the president does still talk to Corey Lewandowski from the campaign, to Dave Bossie from the campaign. Now will Steve Bannon get added to that list? I think it's a fair question.
You know, he's presumably, I don't know if he will, but he was one of the leaders of Breitbart, which is reacting. And I want to show our viewers a tweet that just came out by one of the senior editors, one of the top writers at Breitbart, from Joel Pollack. You see that hashtag war. That is a pretty strong statement.
Point, doesn't it? One of the biggest questions I've had as we've kind of wondered when, not if, but when Steve Bannon would be out of this White House, is how the conservative media will respond, and particularly Breitbart, which is a place that's been promotional of this president. What will they do? Will you see them start to turn on Trump? And I think that Joel's tweet there says the answer is undoubtedly yes. Is not going to have a soft landing in these places because Steve Bannon is one of their own. He has been rejected, and they now feel isolated, and they feel like this is a president they boosted, they and their ilk boosted, and now they're being tossed out of the inner circle, and they don't seem to like it.
And this was always the danger of bringing in Bannon, right? I mean, that it would end in this way almost inevitably, but that the outcome there when you do that with someone with the ties that he has to Breitbart and into the broader movement there is that this happens and that they turn on you. The one thing I'll say, and I keep coming back to, and John's made this point, is Donald Trump is the only advisor that matters in the White House. If you've learned anything, if I've learned anything in 7 months of this presidency, it's that John Kelly has said privately, semi-publicly, I'm focusing on the of staff part, that we're going to try and get the staff in order. Departures, Anthony Scaramucci, though, sort of departed himself, and Steve Bannon makes some sense. But the central guy, the guy who's not going to disappear from any pictures in the Oval Office, is Donald Trump. Theoretically, could Mike Pence have some influence on him? Sure, though Mike Pence has been his most ardent, steady defender, even as it related to Charlottesville and his comments there, or lack thereof. So what's difficult is we debate all this stuff. I don't think it is beneficial to Donald Trump to have Breitbart on the outside, to have Bannon on the outside. At the same time, you know, there's a lot of Bannon's views in Donald Trump, whether they were there, whether Bannon cultivated them. Regardless, there's a lot of Steve Bannon in the one guy that we know who matters in the White House.
And you know what was significant was that as we speak right now, the president's at Camp David with a couple dozen of his top advisors, cabinet officials, national security officials. And when the White House earlier today released the list of who was participating to discuss the future of Afghanistan and other critically important issues, Steve Bannon's name was not there.
No, it's a principals meeting in the National Security Council. And you recall, this was a controversy at the very beginning of the administration. He was once on that and then removed from it. Had this meeting taken place at the beginning of this administration, Steve Bannon would have been there. The Breitbart reporter for the White House, Charlie Spearing, his tweet along the lines of what you just showed, and kids, that's the day when Bannon the Barbarian was born. Whether or not that power that Bannon might have on the outside is going to be aimed at Donald Trump, or to John King's point earlier, more aimed at Jared Kushner, Ivanka, Gary Cohn, Dina Powell, the globalists in the mind of Bannon. You know, I don't know that
John Kelly too.
I don't know that it'll be directly aimed at the president, but if you're around the president and considered anathema to the Bannon worldview, I would watch out. Like, you're going to have some heat coming.
John, let's not forget the week that this is all taking place. What happened this week? An amazing, historic week. The reaction of the president to the disaster, to the tragedy that occurred in Charlottesville, Virginia, and culminating with a whole bunch of Republicans strongly condemning the president of the United States, including Mitt Romney, only today issuing a statement, whether he intended to or not, what he, the president, communicated caused racists to rejoice, minorities to weep, and the vast heart of America to mourn.
make a key point, the President of the United States. I think that's been the recurring theme here. You can change personnel, and maybe this is necessary. The President, this will give some moderate Republicans especially who viewed Steve Bannon as toxic from day one and who maybe don't like to go out and criticize the President, who are getting asked about what he said Tuesday, the moral equivalency of the counter-demonstrators to the KKK and the neo-Nazis. It'll give them to say, well, this is a positive change by the President. But it is the President. It is the President. And with this further fracturing, Breitbart is now at war. Breitbart was on his side for the first 7 months, right? If you further fracture the conservative Republican, what you want to call a conversation, does that help you or hurt you when you're trying to get votes for Obamacare? I would argue it hurts if you're in this mess. Does it help or hurt when the conservatives come back next week and say, we're not going to vote to raise the debt ceiling unless we get offsetting spending cuts? A recurring drama we've heard throughout Republican years in Washington, but now you have a Republican president. So administration that has zero significant legislative achievements before you now is in a more messy environment, even on its side, the part that it has been able to keep together. The Trump base has been solid. His other poll numbers are terrible. The Trump base has been relatively solid from day one. Does this impact that? The question mark. But if it does, it further hurts a president who is deeply and profoundly wounded right now.
Just by the way, one quick thing. I mean, there's so much news every week, it's hard to remember all. John is 100% right. Let me just add other than attacking Mitch McConnell repeatedly, the Senate Majority Leader last week, tweeting out his support for Kelly Ward, a primary challenger to a sitting incumbent, attacking Lindsey Graham, another sitting incumbent. This is not the way for someone who has no legislative accomplishments, for someone who we really don't know ideologically what the way forward is, and we certainly don't know legislatively what the way forward is. It's easy to say, we're on to tax reform. Well, what and how? Presidents who are much more legislatively versed than Donald Trump have failed at that. Right. You also have the fact that this is someone, I forgot to mention, Lisa Murkowski, Ben Sasse, Susan Collins. There are a lot of senators who Donald Trump has insulted in literally the last 3 weeks, much less since he's been in office, that he's going to theoretically need if he's going to do anything, and they're not going to be for him, even whether Steve Bannon works there or doesn't work.
I'm going to try to do it despite him, not for him.
Yeah.
Reince Priebus gone. Anthony Scaramucci, how long did he last? Not very long. Gone.
10 full days.
Sean Spicer, gone. Now Steve Bannon, gone from the White House. The exodus continues. Our special coverage resumes right after a quick break.
You're out of CNN breaking news.
Hello, I'm Wolf Blitzer. Wherever you're watching from around the world, thanks very much for joining us. We begin with breaking news right here in Washington, D.C. President Trump's chief strategist, Steve Bannon, is now out. That, according to two administration officials, the president and the White House, they were debating how and when to dismiss Steve Bannon, but now we have confirmed he will no longer be the chief strategist over at the White House. Steve Bannon, 63 years old, is out. Let's go to our senior White House correspondent, Jim Acosta. He's covering the president up in Bedminster, New Jersey. This is major news, a very significant development, and it comes on the heels of several other senior officials leaving.
That's right, Wolf. And I'm just hearing from one White House official in the last couple of minutes here that it is believed that Steve Bannon resigned, but it is also believed that he may have been given the option to resign. So it sounds like, Wolf, from a source I'm just talking to in the last couple of minutes here, that he was essentially forced out of this position as chief strategist at the White House. And one of the big reasons why, and we've heard this time and again from people close to the president does not like other people inside the White House stealing the limelight. And you saw this happen time and again. Steve Bannon appearing on the cover of Time magazine, Steve Bannon lampooned on Saturday Night Live. There were times that this just got under the president's skin. And as you know, over the last week, Steve Bannon has been doing some pretty high-profile interviews. We were just hearing from sources yesterday that Bannon said he was doing this to divert attention from the president's very disastrous press conference that he had on Tuesday over at Trump Tower. That apparently rankled people inside the White House as well. I also heard from sources earlier in the week, Wolf, that new Chief of Staff John Kelly simply felt that Steve Bannon was not a team player, that he was out there sort of promoting himself had his own agenda and was not putting the president's agenda first. That was something that was just not going to work, and the new power structure, as the way it was explained to me by White House sources, under John Kelly. And so it really is no surprise here that Steve Bannon is out. One concern that they do have inside the White House, and we've heard this from several sources over a long period of time, because it's been speculated before that Steve Bannon would be pushed out. There is a concern inside the White House that now that Bannon is on the outside, what is going to be the reaction? As you know, Wolf, Steve Bannon was one of the top executives at Breitbart Online. He was the head of Breitbart Online for some time. That is a very conservative, hard right outlet, and the concern is that that Steve Bannon will direct potshots at this White House from the outside. That is a concern that the president and his team have had for some time, but nevertheless, the feeling was inside the White House, talking to several sources, Wolf, that Steve Bannon just had to go. This was becoming sort of an untenable situation because he was just creating too much controversy for himself. And so the president and his team apparently feeling that it was appropriate for him to go. Again, I'm being told by a White House source in just the last couple of minutes that the belief is that he resigned, that he stepped aside, but there is also a belief inside the White House that he was given that option. So essentially he was pushed out, Wolf.
It's a very, very significant development, and it comes following several other very, very high-level resignations, which raises the question right now, and I wonder if you could answer it, why now, and what's going to be the impact of all these significant staff shakeups?
Well, we know when John Kelly came in that he was implementing some changes that were not going to sit well with some people inside the White House. He was restricting access to the president, not only in person. Remember, before John Kelly came on board, Reince Priebus was the chief of staff, and people from the inside of the White House to the outside of the White House, the president's friends and so on, had these sort of walk-in privileges where they could essentially go in and see the president whenever they felt like it and give him any opinion they felt like giving. My understanding is from talking to top officials at the White House that John Kelly has even been getting on the phone and sitting in on phone calls with people trying to talk to the president on the phone. So John Kelly is certainly trying to clamp down on the advice, the input, the information that this president is receiving as a way to sort of streamline the process over there, and also to try to prevent some of the problems that obviously you see play out with the president, where he puts out tweets that are factually incorrect when he goes out and makes statements like he did the other day at the press conference at Trump Tower, which just ignited a firestorm of controversy. John Kelly is trying to get a handle on all of that. But of course, Wolf, as you know, the chief of staff can only do so much. He still works for the president. He can't control what the president says or does 24 hours a day.
Jim Acosta, stand by. Our White House reporter Caitlin Collins is working the story for us as well. You're getting more inside information, Caitlin. What are you hearing?
Yeah, so obviously we know that Steve Bannon is out. We do not know if he resigned or if he was asked to resign by the president today, Wolf, but we do know that the president was furious this week after Steve Bannon did this interview with a reporter for the American Prospect. As you know, Wolf, in that interview, Steve Bannon contradicted the president on North Korea, saying that there is no military solution for it. And he also asserted that he could make personnel changes at the State Department. He was bad-mouthing his colleagues over at the White House. And we know that the president was furious about that interview. That's been a problem that's come up before with Steve Bannon. The president does not like when Steve Bannon gets credit for his success. Back in April, he told a New York Post columnist that he was his own best strategist. And even this week, we heard from the president he would not guarantee Steve Bannon's job security. This week at Trump Tower, in a press conference with reporters, he said that Steve Bannon was a good person, but he said we'll have to see about Steve Bannon's future. And I guess, Wolf, we're seeing about Steve Bannon's future right now today.
We certainly are. Steve Bannon out as chief strategist at the White House. Let's get some analysis. Joining us, CNN politics reporter and editor-at-large Chris Cillizza, CNN political director David Chalian, CNN politics editor Juana Summers, and our chief national correspondent John King. John, shouldn't have come as a surprise after this interview in the American Prospect when he said this about the president of the United States, referring to the North Korean strategy. He said, in Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea, Trump has met his match. The risk of two arrogant fools blundering into a nuclear exchange is more serious than at any time since October 1962. two arrogant fools.
You shouldn't say that about your boss anyway, especially when your boss is the President of the United States. It's stunning. The entire interview is stunning. But in that, he's not only talking about two arrogant fools, saying his boss, the President of the United States, is a fool. He also essentially said, pay no attention to what you heard from the President last week when the President was saying locked and loaded, fire and fury, using the more muscular rhetoric about North Korea. He says there is no military option. We know there's no military option unless you're prepared for millions of people to die in Seoul. So he went on the record. He insists after the fact he didn't think it was an interview. In criticizing the president. So Steve Bannon has been a controversy inside the Trump White House from day one, and on this day, he is gone. But this is, the defining question is, Steve Bannon is not the source of the chaos in the White House. He may be part of the chaos in the White House, but the source of the chaos in the White House is the president. What will the president do? His first chief of staff is gone. Now his chief strategist is gone. They've had a very hard time. I know people who they reached out to for chief of staff who said no. John Kelly now has that job. I know several people they reached out for communications and strategy jobs who said no. Now what happens? It's the president who sends mixed signals and conflicting signals on policy. It's the president who lashes out on Twitter with anger and outbursts at his critics. And it is the president who dug the ditch much deeper this past week with his moral and character failing after Charlottesville. So Steve Bannon can go. That will create theater and drama here in Washington. It could create a backlash among media elements, especially who are part of the Trump base and part of his support. But the biggest question here is, if the president decided it's time to come to do this, what lesson does he learn from it, if any?
David Chalian.
Well, we should do away with the word resignation right now, because I mean, perhaps he offered a piece of paper. That's like saying if he's going to do this to spend more time with his family. Let's do away with that. He's out because the president wanted him out, because the president's chief of staff felt this was part of the process of bringing order to this West Wing and more discipline to this West Wing. John is exactly right, and this is exactly what we discussed when Reince Priebus was fired, who also, by the way, said he resigned. And when he was shown the door, the same thing. Was all of a sudden something going to dramatically change? No, because the man who sits in the Oval Office is the same. Now, getting rid of